my dear readers, we now find ourselves at the beginning of Act 2, a turning point where the plot thickens and shadows deepen. For those who wish to catch up on the events of Act 1, I must direct you to the video linked in the description and comment section. Do give it a listen, and once you're quite up to speed, do share your thoughts in the comments. After all, every detail matters in a tale such as this. Now, let us proceed, shall we? The prison, heavy with its age and its secrets, seemed more oppressive as night fell, the shadows pooling in corners like old memories refusing to die. She had spent the better part of the day observing, listening, and piecing together the fragments that had been left in the wake of Arthur Baines's supposed escape. She had followed the breadcrumbs, the small whispers in the air, the little inconsistencies that others overlooked. Now, in the fading light, she was on her way to something she could almost feel was waiting for her, something hidden behind the walls, just out of sight. Guided by a series of discreet hints from the prison's layout, she approached a small forgotten door behind the administrative wing, one that had escaped routine scrutiny. It was the sort of place that people didn't notice because they weren't meant to. The door was a dull, unassuming thing, half concealed behind a stack of cleaning supplies. If anyone had looked at it, they would have passed right by, but not Miss Marple. She saw it for what it was, the entrance to something that wasn't meant to be found. Her fingers traced the cold brass handle. The door creaked open on ancient hinges, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air inside was stale, carrying the smell of dust and mildew. A claustrophobic silence settled around her as she stepped inside, the walls seeming to close in. This was no ordinary passage. It had been deliberately hidden, forgotten by those who had designed the place. The narrow hallway twisted and turned, disappearing around corners and up short flights of stairs. There was an unsettling quality to it, as if it was an afterthought, a space meant to be concealed, never to be noticed. It didn't belong to the well-lit, orderly parts of the prison. It belonged to the parts that were left in the dark. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground ahead of her. Her shoes made no sound on the cold stone, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise with the strange, unsettling sense that she was not alone, though she knew full well that she was. Her gaze dropped to the floor, where something caught her eye, a faint imprint of a boot, barely visible against the dust-covered. She crouched down, her fingers brushing lightly over the mark. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Someone had been here recently. The print was fresh, the edges still sharp, as if the person had been in a hurry. The path it led to wasn't clear, but Miss Marple could sense that she was closer to something important. As she continued deeper into the corridor, she found a glint of something metallic on the floor, half hidden beneath an old, crumpled piece of paper. Her hand reached for it, and she pulled free a small tool, jagged at the edges. A key, broken in half. Miss Marple turned the key over in her hand. It wasn't one of the standard keys used for the cells. No, this was something different. Something that didn't belong to the prison. A quiet breath escaped her lips. She'd found something, but what did it mean? The tool was evidence, but it only raised more questions. With a careful step, she stood up, tucking the broken key into the folds of her coat. She took one last look down the narrow hallway, her eyes calculating. Whoever had been here had meant to keep this passage a secret, but the cracks were beginning to show. Later that evening, in the solitude of a small corner near the administrative offices, Miss Marple sat with her notebook open before her. The air inside the room was thick with the smell of old books, of ink and parchment. The sounds of the prison had faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the scattered evidence she had collected throughout the day. She turned over the notes from her interviews, each word carefully recorded, each gesture noted. The image of Baines's cell, the cryptic note, the broken key, it all danced in her mind, spinning into a web she had yet to untangle. But she could feel it, the way all the pieces were slowly aligning, forming the shape of something much larger than the escape of a single prisoner. Miss Marple's fingers hovered over the page, tracing the words she had written earlier. "Truth hides where authority sleeps." The phrase echoed in her mind, repeating itself like a refrain. It had been the key, quite literally. A clue hidden in plain sight, leading her towards something more insidious. Baines hadn't escaped at all. He had been the diversion, a pawn in a much larger scheme. She sat back, her eyes narrowing as she pieced together the evidence. The broken lock, the security logs that had been tampered with, the fresh boot print in the hidden corridor. The key, now safely tucked in her pocket, was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a tool, it was a message. Someone had orchestrated Baines's escape, not to free him, but to cover something up. Miss Marple's mind whirred with the sudden clarity of the revelation. The escape had been a masterful diversion, an illusion designed to shift focus away from something far darker happening inside the prison walls. A crime was being concealed, and Baines was the scapegoat. He was meant to be found dead to reinforce the illusion. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It was all so cleverly done, so carefully laid out, like a trap. But the truth, she knew, was never truly hidden for long. It only needed the right person to see it. Her eyes flicked back to the notebook in front of her. There were still details to connect, pieces that had yet to fall into place, but Miss Marple had a feeling that the threads she had pulled together so far would soon reveal the full extent of the plot. She could almost hear the whisper of footsteps from the hidden corridor, echoing with the secrets of those who had hidden their sins in the dark. "The pieces are aligning," she murmured softly, her eyes focused on the distant shadows of the prison. The truth was out there, just waiting to be uncovered, and she would find it no matter where it was hiding. The meeting room in the administrative block was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards underfoot and the dull hum of the gas lamps. The air was thick, weighed down by a suffocating tension that seemed to seep into every corner of the space. The walls, lined with dark oak and the faded portraits of long-dead governors, seemed to close in, their silent gaze adding to the pressure of the moment. Miss Jane Marple sat at the head of a long, polished table. She appeared small in the large, imposing room, her presence almost invisible to the casual observer, but anyone who truly looked would see the stillness in her posture, the deliberate way her hands were folded, the focused glint in her eyes. She didn't need to say a word to command attention. Her silence spoke louder than any of the suspects could. One by one, the individuals who had been inextricably tied to the events surrounding Arthur Baines's escape entered the room. Each one moved with the same measured, cautious steps. None of them seemed eager for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Warden Bartholomew was the first to arrive. His tall frame filled the doorway, the weight of his uniform adding a layer of authority that did little to mask the anxiety in his eyes. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple before taking his seat, his movements stiff, like a man who had grown too accustomed to sitting in judgment, but not in the seat of the accused. Next came Accountant Felicity Reed. She was a picture of composure, her neatly tailored dress and immaculately done-up hair a sharp contrast to the unease that flickered behind her eyes. She sat down without a word, her lips pressed together as if she were holding something back, something she wasn't ready to share. Senior Guard Clive Henderson entered last. His tall, broad frame blocked the doorway for a moment before he made his way to the table. There was an edge to his movements, a tension in the way he adjusted his uniform, as if every fibre of his being was screaming to flee. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the others, before he finally settled into his chair. The silence that hung between him and the others was thick with something unsaid. He cleared his throat as he glanced at Miss Marple, his jaw tightening. Finally, prison official Elaine Wentworth, the last of the group, slid into the room. She was the least visible in her presence, but not by choice. Her sharp eyes flicked around the room, and she took a seat with the grace of someone used to maintaining control in every situation. But there was something in her gaze that betrayed her, an impatience, an edge of irritation that hadn't been there before. As the last chair was filled, the room seemed to breathe with an unseen weight, as though the walls themselves were waiting for the first word to break the silence. It was a stage set for a drama to unfold, where the true natures of the players would soon be revealed. The tension was thick, but Miss Marple's calm, measured gaze swept over the group, taking in the subtleties of each person's posture, their shifting eyes, the faint tremble of a hand or a nervous cough. The air itself seemed to quiver with the weight of their secrets. "Good afternoon, all," Miss Marple said, her voice light and unassuming, as though she were simply making small talk over tea, but the effect was immediate. Each person stilled, aware that the moment they had been dreading had finally arrived. The faintest smile played at the corner of Miss Marple's lips as she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Warden Bartholomew. "I trust everything is in order, Warden? The prison seems to be running smoothly?" Bartholomew straightened in his chair, his gaze flickering briefly to the others before he replied, his voice stiff. "Yes, of course, all matters are under control." "And the staff?" Miss Marple continued, her tone polite but probing. "I imagine they must be quite unsettled by the recent events. A bit of anxiety, perhaps?" Bartholomew stiffened further, his lips tightening as though he were choosing his words carefully. "It's natural, I suppose, but they'll manage. We've handled disturbances before." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose so, but there's always the possibility that some disturbances go unnoticed, don't you think?" Her eyes lingered on him for a beat longer than necessary, then shifted toward Felicity Reed, who had been quiet up until now. Felicity Reed shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edges of the table. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened imperceptibly as she turned her attention to the accountant. "Miss Reed, you've been at Blackwood for quite some time, haven't you? I would imagine you've seen your share of financial challenges?" Reed's eyes narrowed, but she forced a smile. "Of course, but everything here is accounted for, Miss Marple. There's nothing unusual. The finances are—" She paused, but the brief hesitation didn't go unnoticed. "In order?" "Good," Miss Marple said with a soft smile. "It's always good to know that everything is as it should be." She leaned back in her chair, letting the silence hang for a moment, then glanced over at Senior Guard Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, I understand you've been with Blackwood for a long time. That must mean you've seen many things during your tenure." Henderson's gaze darted nervously across the table, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes. "I've seen a few things, yes, some more than others, but nothing out of the ordinary, Miss Marple. Nothing unusual." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft and understanding. "But sometimes the ordinary becomes a bit more complicated, doesn't it?" Henderson's jaw clenched, his eyes shifting again toward the door as though he were eager to leave. Miss Marple smiled inwardly, noting the way his foot tapped lightly against the floor in rhythm with his unease. Finally, Miss Marple turned her attention to Elaine Wentworth. "And Miss Wentworth, I understand you've had your share of responsibilities here as well. You must be feeling the pressure with so much going on." Wentworth met her gaze squarely, her back straight and her hands folded neatly on the table. "I'm accustomed to pressure, Miss Marple. It's part of the job." Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "But I imagine that even the most controlled situations have their cracks." She let the words hang in the air before she turned her attention back to the group as a whole. "You know, I often find that when people are under pressure, they tend to reveal things they might not intend." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. The air was thick with the weight of the conversation, and Miss Marple's calm, steady gaze seemed to extract the truth from each of her suspects without so much as a single overt accusation. Each of them had been carefully rehearsing their stories, constructing a facade of innocence. But the cracks were beginning to show. The tension in the room was palpable, tighter, more brittle now. Miss Marple's gentle probing had started to unravel their composure, one nervous glance, one slight twitch at a time. In every word she spoke, light as it seemed, there was the weight of silent accusation, slowly wearing down the masks they wore. With each remark, The carefully constructed facades began to crumble, revealing raw nerves of guilt beneath. The trap had been set. And soon Miss Marple would expose the truth they'd worked so hard to hide. The heavy oak door to the meeting room creaked shut behind the last of the suspects, sealing them in together. The air, thick with tension, felt suffocating, the walls pressing in as though the room itself were aware of the secrets it contained. Miss Marple stood at the head of the long table, her presence at once unassuming and commanding. She said nothing for a moment, letting the silence hang, stretching it out just enough to make her audience uneasy. Warden Bartholomew shifted in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Felicity Reed, the accountant, sat with her back rigid, her eyes darting from one suspect to the next. Senior Guard Henderson sat with his legs splayed out, trying to appear relaxed, but failing. Elaine Wentworth's sharp gaze never wavered from Miss Marple, though her lips were pressed tight, as if she were holding back something, perhaps a confession, perhaps a challenge. "I suppose we've all had our say," Miss Marple said finally, breaking the silence, with the calm certainty of someone who already knew the answer. "But there are a few things I've yet to mention, and I believe we're all in need of some clarity." She paced slowly around the table, her steps measured, her eyes flicking to each suspect in turn. The words she was about to speak were not just conclusions, they were truths that had been carefully pieced together, truths that would send shockwaves through the room. "Arthur Baines's escape," Miss Marple began, her voice soft but unmistakably firm, "was never an escape at all. It was a distraction, a ruse designed to draw attention away from something far more sinister." She paused, letting her words settle into the thickening air, watching the flicker of realization in their eyes. Warden Bartholomew's face twitched, and his hand moved instinctively to the collar of his shirt, as though the tightness there was suffocating him. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice low but edged with nervousness. Miss Marple's eyes met his, cool and steady. "I'm suggesting that while the prison was busy chasing the ghost of an escaped convict, someone was busy concealing a murder." The room fell still, the weight of her words sinking in, each person taking a moment to process the enormity of what was being said. "Someone within these walls," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady but gaining strength, "killed Dr. Leonard Fitzroy, the prison's ethical adviser, and they used Baines's escape to cover their tracks." The quiet murmur of disbelief passed among the suspects, but Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had expected this. It was all part of the plan, to make them doubt her, to make them think it was impossible. "And no," Reed spoke up, her voice a touch too sharp. "That's absurd. Fitzroy was just an adviser. He didn't have anything to do with Baines's escape." "Oh, but he did," Miss Marple countered, turning her gaze to the accountant, letting the silence stretch between them. "You see, Miss Reed, Dr. Fitzroy had discovered something he shouldn't have." She allowed the words to hang in the air before continuing. "He found discrepancies in the prison's finances. Something he was going to report. Something that would have implicated several people here." The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the weight of the accusation were pressing down on the very walls. Miss Marple's eyes shifted briefly to the hidden key she had found in the secret corridor. "The key, Miss Reed, wasn't just a tool, it was a signal, a reminder that someone was keeping things hidden, and it was no accident that it was found in the place where Fitzroy was killed." Felicity Reed's face blanched, her breath catching slightly in her throat, but she didn't speak. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her, trying to maintain composure, though her fingers twitched with the effort. Miss Marple turned next to Senior Guard Henderson. "And you, Mr. Henderson, weren't just a bystander in all of this. You were the one who overlooked the tampering with the security logs. You saw someone leave the restricted corridor, but you didn't act on it. Why?" Henderson's jaw clenched, and for a moment he looked ready to protest, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew as well as Miss Marple did that there was no way out of this. His hesitation gave him away. He had known about the murder, and he had chosen to remain silent. Miss Marple's gaze finally moved to Elaine Wentworth. The prison official sat straight, her posture rigid, but there was something in her eyes, something that flickered for just a moment, that told Miss Marple she had been the one pulling the strings all along. "And you, Miss Wentworth," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, "were the one who orchestrated the escape, the one who used Baines as a diversion. You knew about the corruption, and you wanted to keep it all buried, but when Fitzroy started digging, you couldn't afford for him to get too close." Wentworth's lips twitched. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Miss Marple took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're all involved, each of you playing a part in this cover-up, but there's one thing you didn't count on, me." The silence in the room was deafening. The game was up. Miss Marple straightened, her hands folding neatly in front of her. Fitzroy's murder was never about him. It was about the secrets buried within these walls, the money, the lies, the corruption. Baines's escape wasn't meant to free him, it was meant to divert attention, and it worked. For a while. Her gaze swept across the table, locking eyes with each suspect in turn. "But you underestimated how far the truth would go. It's been right in front of you the entire time, hidden in the cracks of your own deception." Warden Bartholomew swallowed hard, his face pale as he leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched into fists on the table, but there was no way out now. Miss Marple had laid bare the truth, the way a surgeon cuts away the rot to reveal what lies beneath. The room was still, but Miss Marple's voice cut through the quiet like a scalpel. "I believe that concludes everything," she said, her voice mild but carrying the weight of finality. "The truth, as they say, always comes to light. In that charged silence, the consequences of their actions were clear. The truth had been laid bare, and no amount of hiding could change that now. The room was stifling, the air thick with tension. A single gas lamp flickered above the long table, casting pale light on the faces of the 4 suspects. Warden Bartholomew, his usually proud posture now deflated, sat stiffly at the head of the table. Felicity Reed, the accountant, sat next to him, her fingers twitching with the tension of her situation. Senior Guard Henderson, his face grim and set, clenched his hands into tight fists, as though bracing himself for the worst. Elaine Wentworth, her composed facade barely intact, was the last to sit, her eyes darting between the others as if searching for an escape. Miss Marple stood at the front of the room, her gaze sweeping across the group, taking in every twitch, every glance. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet, its rhythmic sound adding to the growing pressure in the room. She didn't speak for a long moment, allowing the silence to deepen. Finally, she broke it with a soft, calm voice. "I think we are all aware that something far darker than an escape is at the heart of this case." She turned toward Elaine Wentworth, who had stiffened in her seat at the mention of her name. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze sharpening like a blade. "You see, it was never about Arthur Baines. His escape was nothing but a smokescreen, a distraction. The true crime was the murder of Mr. Leonard Fitzroy, the prison's ethical adviser." A faint gasp echoed around the room. Bartholomew's eyes widened, and Reed's hand shot up to her throat in a nervous gesture. Henderson remained silent, his face unreadable, though his body was tense, his legs braced, ready to spring into action should things turn violent. "Fitzroy," Miss Marple continued, "was beginning to uncover something dangerous for you, Miss Wentworth. He was too close to the truth." She paused, her voice growing colder with each word. "He discovered discrepancies in the prison's financial records. Embezzlement, to be precise. A clever scheme that you, Miss Wentworth, were at the heart of." Miss Marple walked slowly around the room, her soft shoes making no sound on the floor. "The security system was a key part of your plan, wasn't it? You knew that the prison's surveillance cameras were unreliable, and that with a little manipulation no one would notice your movements. You used the hidden corridor, the one no one thought to check, to access the places where the evidence was kept. And then, when Fitzroy came too close to the truth, You did what anyone desperate enough would do. You silenced him." She turned back to face Wentworth, who was now sweating, her face pale. "A silenced pistol, quick, efficient, a shot that left no noise, no trace, just the body of a man who had been about to ruin everything you worked so hard to conceal." Wentworth's lips trembled, her breath shallow. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice faltered, her calm facade cracking under the pressure. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" Miss Marple replied, her voice smooth, almost gentle. "Let's look at the evidence, shall we?" She turned to the others, her gaze settling on Felicity Reed. "You were the one who handled the financial records, weren't you, Miss Reed? You knew exactly what Fitzroy was digging into. You're the one who made sure the discrepancies were covered up, the false reports, the doctored figures. It was you who tried to keep the money hidden, wasn't it?" Reed's face flushed, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked to Wentworth, her expression betraying her guilt, and Miss Marple didn't miss the flicker of fear that passed between them. "And you, Mr. Henderson," Miss Marple continued, turning to the senior guard, "you didn't mean to help, but you did. You were the one who overlooked the tampering with the security logs. You were the one who didn't ask questions when Miss Wentworth moved through the restricted areas. You allowed her to use the hidden corridor as if it were an extension of her office." Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched. "I didn't know what she was doing. I didn't—" He started to protest, but the words trailed off. The guilt was written on his face, plain for everyone to see. Miss Marple turned back to Wentworth. "You thought you were clever. You thought you could outsmart everyone, but you didn't reckon with one thing, the truth. The truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deep it's buried." Miss Marple's voice dropped, becoming more forceful. "The key, the security logs, the hidden corridor. It was all part of your plan to keep Fitzroy from exposing you. You knew you had to eliminate him, and when you did, you thought you'd gotten away with it, but all you've done is paint a clear picture for everyone to see." The room was silent now, the weight of Miss Marple's words hanging heavy. Wentworth's face had turned ashen, and her hands gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. She swallowed hard, her breath quick and shallow. "You're finished," Miss Marple said, her voice low and certain. "Everything you've done is laid out before us. There's nowhere left to hide." Warden Bartholomew slumped in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and resignation. I didn't know," he muttered. "I had no idea. I never thought—" "No, you didn't think," Miss Marple interrupted. "You were too busy pretending that everything was fine to notice what was happening right under your nose. The money, the cover-ups, the murder. It was all happening right here in your prison." She turned to Wentworth, who was now trembling, her eyes darting desperately around the room, looking for any way out. "It's over, Miss Wentworth. The truth is out, and it's going to cost you everything." For a moment the room was utterly still. Then Wentworth broke, her shoulders sagging as she lowered her head. "You have no idea what it's like," she whispered, her voice thick with defeat. "I did what I had to do. I couldn't let it all fall apart. I couldn't let him ruin everything." "Perhaps you should have thought about that before you killed him," Miss Marple replied, her voice tinged with dry, almost clinical detachment. The truth had come to light, all the secrets, all the lies, laid bare under Miss Marple's steady gaze. There was nowhere left for them to hide. The room, once filled with the tension of uncertainty, now pulsed with the quiet certainty of justice. Miss Marple stood, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her work done. The shadows in the corners seemed to recede, and the oppressive weight that had hung in the air for so long finally lifted. The truth, as it always did, had found its way into the light. The room had grown stifling, the tension pressing in on all sides, wrapping around the suspects like a thick fog. The faint hum of the gas lamps, the heavy silence. It all seemed to wait for something to break the stillness, for the final moment to unfold. Elaine Wentworth sat at the far end of the table, her hands trembling ever so slightly, her knuckles white from gripping the edge. She hadn't moved since Miss Marple's revelation, though her eyes flickered from suspect to suspect, then to the door, as if considering an escape she knew wasn't coming. Her composed demeanour had cracked, and now only fragments of her former poise remained. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, unyielding. The others, Warden Bartholomew, Felicity Reed, Senior Guard Henderson, sat frozen, their eyes darting between Wentworth and the quiet detective. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in tighter, as if all the hidden lies and deceit were slowly coming to life around them. The evidence was irrefutable. Each clue Miss Marple had uncovered led to this moment. The hidden corridor, the tampered security, the financial records, the broken key, and with it the slow, methodical revelation that tied Wentworth directly to the murder of Leonard Fitzroy. Elaine Wentworth's lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes were wide now, filled with something close to panic, as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. She swallowed hard, the effort nearly visible, before she finally managed to speak. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as though the words were trying to escape before she could stop them. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The confession, soft and trembling as a whispered regret, resonated in the still air. Each word hung like an accusation, cutting through the room, each syllable unravelling the tightly wound threads of the case. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. Her presence, unassuming as ever, seemed to fill the space with quiet authority. "You knew Fitzroy was getting too close," she said, her tone neither harsh nor sympathetic, but full of the calm certainty that only comes when the truth has already been laid bare. "He was about to expose you, wasn't he? Your little scheme. The embezzlement. The misuse of prison funds." Elaine Wentworth's eyes flickered, and for a moment her facade of control nearly shattered. "He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to interfere," she muttered, her voice thickening with an almost desperate justification. "I was doing everything I could to keep this place running, to keep things in order." "You were running it into the ground, Miss Wentworth," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Your greed blinded you to the consequences, and when Fitzroy started digging into your affairs, you couldn't afford to let him expose the truth." Elaine's hands twisted in her lap, her shoulders hunched slightly as though she were shrinking under the weight of her own guilt. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, barely more than a whisper. "He was going to ruin everything I had worked for. And then I thought, if I could just stop him, just for a moment, I could fix it." "And that moment," Miss Marple continued, her eyes never leaving Wentworth's face, "was when you used a silenced pistol to end Fitzroy's life. You killed him, Miss Wentworth, in that hidden corridor where no one would think to look, and you thought you could get away with it?" Elaine Wentworth's face crumpled. The rigid control that had once defined her collapsed, leaving only a broken woman. She looked up at the others, her eyes wet with unshed tears, her voice cracking. "I'd never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to fix it. I thought if I could keep the prison from falling apart, I'd—" Her voice trailed off into nothing, the rest of the sentence hanging in the air, unfinished. The silence stretched between them all, thick with the weight of her confession. Behind her, Senior Guard Henderson sat still, his face unreadable. He had been complicit in the cover-up, of course, but it wasn't intentional. He hadn't known what Wentworth had done. He'd only known that she'd needed his help, and he had given it without questioning. Now, as the truth unfolded before him, he realized the depth of his own unwitting involvement. He shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tight. He was not guilty of murder, but he was far from innocent. He had helped her, had turned a blind eye to things that he should have noticed. His shoulders sagged as the realization hit him. Inspector Fowler, who had been standing in the background, observing silently, finally stepped forward. His expression was grim, the lines of responsibility etched deep into his face. "Miss Wentworth," he said, his voice firm, "you are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Leonard Fitzroy. The rest of you," he continued, turning to the others, "will need to answer for your roles in this. There will be consequences for what you've allowed to happen in this prison." Elaine Wentworth's face remained pale, but there was a glimmer of something— resignation, perhaps, or acceptance in her eyes. She didn't protest. She didn't scream or try to deny it. She simply nodded, her shoulders trembling as the weight of her crime settled on her like a heavy shroud. The truth, once it was revealed, left no room for argument. Miss Marple's quiet, unassuming demeanour had made her a deadly force in the unravelling of this mystery. Every word she spoke had been a piece of the puzzle, each detail adding to the clarity of the picture she had painted. There was no escaping it now. The lies, the deception, the murder, they had all been laid bare under the unforgiving light of truth. The room, once thick with the smoke of secrets, now felt colder, quieter. The confession had cut through the pretense, and in its wake the guilty had nowhere left to hide. As Wentworth was led from the room, her shoulders slumped in defeat, Henderson remained seated, his gaze fixed on the table. Bartholomew's face was ashen, his hands trembling slightly. Miss Marple, however, was already standing by the window, her eyes fixed on the view outside. She had done her part. The truth had won. The pieces had clicked into place, and justice had been served. The air in the room seemed to lighten, and as the heavy door closed behind Wentworth, the oppressive silence was finally broken. The truth was out, and no one would be the same again. The light of the morning crept through the prison's narrow windows, casting a faint glow over the stone floors. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone and stale sweat, but today there was a new scent in the halls of H.M. Blackwood, a mixture of resolve and change, as if the very air was bracing itself for the storm that had finally come. The walls, once silent witnesses to the prison's long history, now seemed to hum with activity, their shadows stretching under the weight of the revelations that had unfolded the night before. Inspector Fowler stood at the heart of the growing chaos, his sharp eyes flicking between his subordinates. The room around him buzzed with the quick, efficient movements of officers securing evidence, contacting authorities, and preparing the necessary paperwork for arrests. The prison, so used to routine, had been thrown into disarray, and yet, in this new order, there was an undeniable sense of urgency, the kind that only comes when justice begins to cleanse an institution of its darkest secrets. Miss Marple had quietly retired from the scene, leaving the official work to the men in charge. But her presence lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the truth she had so carefully uncovered. Fowler had watched her during the previous day's confrontation, admiring the way she had unravelled the web of lies, piece by piece. Now he took the lead with the same quiet determination, his eyes scanning the room as the officers worked. "We'll begin with Wentworth," Fowler said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He was addressing one of his senior officers, a man with a face lined by years of dealing with the worst of society's underbelly. "Get her out of here. The paperwork for the arrest should already be underway. We'll take her to holding, but we need to make sure she's not going anywhere until we've got everything." The officer nodded and left, and Fowler's gaze flickered over to the group gathered in the corner. The few staff members who had remained loyal, or at least neutral, throughout the entire affair. There was a sense of disillusionment hanging in the air, but also something else, a quiet hope, an understanding that this was the first step toward reform. Mr. Higgins, the young guard who had witnessed so much but said so little until now, stood apart from the group, his hands jammed into his pockets, his eyes distant. The boy had been nervous and uncertain throughout the investigation, but now, as he observed the process of change unfolding before him, something in his demeanour had shifted. The nervous energy that had clung to him like a shadow was gone, replaced by something steadier. He looked less like a man caught up in a game he couldn't understand, and more like someone who had realized that he might have a part to play in righting the wrongs that had plagued the prison. "You all right, Higgins?" Fowler asked, his voice low, but sharp enough to catch the boy's attention. "This is your first time seeing the system, our system, actually do something right." Higgins shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes meeting Fowler's for a long moment before he answered, his voice quiet but firm. "Yeah, I guess I am, sir." He swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. I just didn't know it could happen, you know?" Fowler nodded, his expression unreadable. No one does, not really. It's easier to just live with it, pretend it's all fine, but the truth has a way of getting out in the end. Across the room, the sound of officers moving about, carrying stacks of files, their footsteps sharp and brisk against the stone, filled the air. The administrative chaos was something new for the staff who had lived under the shadow of routine for so long. Now they were beginning to feel the weight of what had happened, and their voices filled the room with a nervous energy. A quiet conversation took place in the corner between two officers, one of whom was shuffling through a folder of paperwork. The words embezzlement, misuse of funds, and internal investigation floated over the air, underscoring the severity of the corruption that had infected Blackwood. Each word was a confirmation that this wasn't just about one murder, it was about an entire system built on lies and manipulation. The cracks that had started with Miss Marple's revelations were now widening, and the prison would have to reckon with its history. Meanwhile, Miss Marple sat quietly in the far corner, a small, unassuming figure in the sea of activity. She had placed her notes aside, folded her hands in her lap, and now observed, her eyes flicking to the officers and the staff alike. It was a quiet victory for her, though she would never have said so aloud. The moment for triumph was not yet, but in her mind the pieces had fallen into place. Justice was being done. It was enough. As she watched the staff begin to process the events, she noted their expressions. Some fearful, others resentful, but there was a thread of something else, too. Relief. Some were beginning to see what they hadn't allowed themselves to see before, that the truth had to be exposed, no matter how deeply it was buried. The last of the paperwork was being completed when Fowler approached Miss Marple, a glint of gratitude in his eyes. "You've done it, Miss Marple. The system's been broken, but now it's starting to heal." Miss Marple looked up at him, her expression as calm as ever. "I wouldn't call it healing, Inspector, not yet. Not until everything's been laid out for all to see. It's one thing to catch the criminals, it's another to make sure no one forgets why it happened." Fowler's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Well, I'll make sure they don't. And I suppose you'll be keeping an eye on me just in case." "I will," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile. "I'll be watching just like everyone else. After all, the truth has a way of showing itself when it's least expected." As she stood to leave, Miss Marple's quiet steps echoed in the empty corridor. The staff, who had once worked under Wentworth's iron hand, now found themselves caught in the reality of reform. Some seemed hesitant, unsure of what the future held, while others, for the first time, allowed themselves a brief glimmer of hope. The walls of H.M. Blackwood had always been a place of confinement, of whispered secrets, but now there was a chance that those walls would come down, brick by brick. The corridors of H.M. Blackwood, once shrouded in deceptive calm, now buzzed with the controlled urgency of justice. The echoes of footsteps and murmured directives spoke of a system determined to cleanse itself of corruption, even if the process was slow and painful. It was the beginning of something, but whether it would lead to true change remained to be seen. For now the truth had found its place, and for the first time in a long while the prison felt like it might finally be able to breathe. The chaos of the past hours had settled into a weary calm. The air in H.M. Blackwood's administrative offices was thick with the weight of bureaucracy and fresh orders. Papers shuffled, locks turned, and officers moved with purpose. The work was far from over, but Miss Jane Marple, now detached from the whirlwind of activity, found herself alone in one of the smaller, dimly lit corridors of the prison. The air here was stale, heavy with the scent of stone and dust, an aroma that had become all too familiar to her in the past days. She paused for a moment, her small frame barely a shadow in the tight space. She had seen the way people moved when they were caught, fidgeting, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, their eyes darting, looking for an escape. Wentworth had been no different. But then, people like her never really change. They simply reveal themselves, piece by piece, under the pressure of their own deceit. For a moment Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. There had been a time, years ago, when she would have worried that exposing the darkness in people's hearts might leave her disillusioned. But as she grew older, she learned that the darkness wasn't new. It was as old as the people who harbored it, and as much as it tried to hide, it always found a way to surface. It was only a matter of time. She turned slowly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and walked toward the exit. The soft sound of her shoes echoed down the stone hallway, but her mind was already far beyond the prison's walls. The work was done, the truth uncovered, but the shadows of what had transpired in Blackwood would remain for a while. The corruption, the greed. It would take time for the prison to cleanse itself, if it ever could. As she neared the heavy doors of the main entrance, she caught a glimpse of the sky through the small window. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the grounds. The colours of dusk, a blend of orange and purple, seemed to offer a quiet contrast to the darkness she had witnessed within these walls. It was a reminder that the world outside, though often clouded with its own troubles, still held light. Miss Marple stepped through the doors, and the cool evening breeze met her with a refreshing touch. The smell of damp earth, the rustling of the leaves in the trees, these small things, simple and yet so grounding, brought a sense of peace. It was as though the world had reset itself, shedding the weight of the prison's secrets. She glanced behind her at the looming structure of H.M. Blackwood. It had been a place of silence and hidden pain, a place where the shadows grew long and the truth had been stifled under layers of deception. But that had changed. The balance had shifted, however fragile. Justice had been served, and the truth had emerged, like a slow dawn breaking through the fog. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile, though it was one tinged with a quiet knowing. Justice, she thought, often takes its time to make itself known, but in the end, it is always there. She stepped away from the prison, her mind already turning to the next case, the next mystery that would call to her. There were always more puzzles to solve, more people to understand, more pieces to fit into the grand mosaic of human nature. As she walked into the fading light of dusk, her heart was lightened. The autumn sun, slipping below the horizon, held a promise in its waning light, that even in the darkest of places, the light of truth would eventually find its way through. It always did, and as Miss Marple disappeared into the shadows, the faintest of smiles remained on her lips. A reminder that though justice may be delayed, it was always within reach.